this next movie is so sick that it made me sick. If you're one of those people that only likes directors who are named after vegetables, then I've got the perfect movie for you. Now, I know some people will say that basil is an herb and not a vegetable, and that it's pronounced basil, not basil, but I don't really care. Basil Dearden was a British director who mainly made generic films, genre films that aren't very widely remembered, I guess. But in the early 1960s, he changed things up a bit with a series of films looking more at social issues. He wasn't the only director doing this at the time, both in the US and the UK. There were a number of serious films borrowing some elements from earlier social realist movements, like from the 30s, but also fitting in with the climax of classic cinema, and also taking inspiration from some of the earliest modern films, which were also coming on the scene. I'm talking about British movies like The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner or The L-Shaped Room, which is two great movies. Second one was reviewed on this channel. Or some more preachy Hollywood films like On the Beach or Inherit the Wind. On the Beach, really cool movie too. Basil Dearden's movies differ from these in some significant ways, but they do share some of this mix of social realism, classic style, with a little hint of modernism, and they offer some kind of social commentary. I'll describe each of these elements in Sapphire. Basil Dearden is probably better known for the movie Victim from 1961, which stars Dirk Bogarde, one of my all-time favorite actors. Victim is really a cool movie. It's more or less a standard sort of crime thriller thing, a story about blackmail, but with an added angle, which is that a bunch of the characters are gay at a time when homosexuality is illegal. This gets weaved into the suspense. Victim was one of the most explicit mainstream-ish films about homosexuality at the time. In fact, it was the first English-language film to feature the term homosexual. It attempts some nuance here and there, but it's kind of mostly a thriller, and it rebukes some stereotypes, but works with others, uses others, has plenty of simplifications that might seem hokey today. Why do I mention all of this about some other movies? Well, because really Sapphire is the same thing. Sapphire came out 2 years earlier. It was apparently what inspired Dearden to go on to make Victim, two very similar movies. This one is about race rather than sexual orientation. Now, where On the Beach and The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner are coming more from a sort of refined, dramatic as in a play, background, Sapphire is, like Victim, mainly a thriller. It starts out with a murder, and it follows a British detective. A detective who makes deductions, offers epigrams, offers sage advice. Victim maybe has a more complex relationship with the law. In Sapphire, it's pretty straightforward. The cops are the good guys, competent and anti-racist. Both. It's not clear that they'll get their man, but they certainly try to. That said, the detective is accompanied by a somewhat brutish assistant, deputy of some sort. This character maybe underscores some prejudices in government, but realistically, it's more about comedic relief and some vague didacticism than any particularly scathing indictment of public institutions. As a thriller, Sapphire is actually pretty good. It's definitely old, definitely mechanical, but once the gears start turning, the mystery is good, and there's plenty of suspense. The movie has some nice twists, has some clever moments. In fact, yeah, it has some clever moments. Since the movie is fun to watch, I don't want to spoil anything, but I will mention that one general element of the plot involves a black character passing for white, as they say. This is a phenomenon that isn't really talked about as much these days. If anything, it's maybe more common to hear about the opposite happening. Maybe you remember Rachel Dolezal. In the early 60s, this idea of passing seemed to be a much more salient thing. There are a number of movies about it, such as Douglas Sirk's Imitation of Life, which I generally recommend. Pretty interesting movie. I think there are a number of reasons why this passing thing was once in the cinematic lexicon. For one thing, a character passing as another race is something that breaks down a binary, breaks down a racial binary that a lot of people were completely committed to at the time. Today, we still see how breaking down binaries can make people pretty anxious. These dramas about passing are also a way to tap into what we would now call privilege, I guess. Why is it that changing the way you dress and speak could completely change someone's outlook in life? That's a fairly compelling question that foregrounds what some people might think of as a certain superficiality of race. On the other hand, these stories of passings usually also involve some kind of betrayal of roots. The moral of the story rarely is that everyone should do it. It's more complicated. Maybe race isn't entirely superficial. Who knows? There's a lot of questions in these passing stories. Even some questions that we still think about today are bound up in this kind of narrative. And you can see how these stories were good fuel for movies with moral dilemmas. There's a lot more to say about this. I strongly suspect that there are some books, or at least someone's PhD thesis, about this kind of narrative. Not sure if they would have brought these two movies together, but maybe. Either way, it's an interesting piece of Sapphire. Rather than offer any strong conclusions, Sapphire and other movies like Imitation of Life tend to lavish in the dilemma. Some people might see this as complexity and appreciate it. Other people might be annoyed that the movie doesn't take sides in one way or another. Stories about passing were probably also an easy way to make a movie about race while still having a predominantly white cast and telling a story rooted in white culture. In some ways, maybe these are the least offensive stories you could tell about race. Interesting. These days, it seems like there's maybe more important things that people spend their time talking about when it comes to race. Overall, this movie is both ahead of its time and dated. It tries to be dialectical at times, but it's predominantly a thriller, a movie that, like I said, rebukes some stereotype but leans on others. The overall message about prejudice in the British middle class is fairly strong. The film offers an uncommon portrait of black professional life as well, and it has a couple complex moments that do, I think, hold up, such as when a landlady explains that she can't host black tenants because her white tenants would leave. Is this an excuse? Is this a lie? She's regretful about this. She poses it as something she doesn't agree with, but a calculation that she's forced to make because of her socioeconomic precarity. She simply can't afford to do anything else. She doesn't agree with it, but she can't afford anything else. But is she lying? Perhaps it's exactly what she wants to do. Interesting. There are some nice moments in this movie, some snafus that I think do still come off, but there's also some stuff that's kind of silly, like the way that music is used in the film. While it might sound like I'm just making a big list of moral objections here, what I'm really getting at, I guess, is the simplicity of the film. There are certain parts that just feel really clunky. Expect to have some explanations trotted out in front of you. Expect to have some morals read directly to you. This movie embraces new storylines, but the style of the film isn't changed at all. Instead, it kind of takes these issues and shoves them into the kaleidoscopic world of a crime drama, and that has mixed results. Like I said, though, as a thriller, this movie really is pretty solid, although the very end is a bit weak. Okay, I wanted to mention these three elements of the film: the social realism, the classic style, and the modern touches. The classic style should be obvious by now. This is predominantly a classic film, some sort of crime thing, noir-ish, a little bit maybe. One thing that's cool about it is that there's a lot of location filming. This doesn't feel like a play at all. We have a camera out on the streets of London with all kinds of real people passing by. Unlike Victim, this film was shot in color, and it's got a lot of cool images and a lot of cool locations and scenes. If you know London, then this is probably a very intriguing film to watch. This location shooting invokes a bit of the neorealist tradition, I guess. And in general, the class aspect of this film really strengthens some of the other story lines. This film kind of sits on the border between the working class and the middle class, I guess. And yeah, I think it adds some complexity to the racial narratives. I already sort of hinted at this with this landlady. The movie also has a few touches of modern cinema in it. Perhaps the most notable is the score, which is jazz. It reminds me of the music for the film Compulsion. Great movie, came out the same year, by the way. Maybe also The Sweet Smell of Success or some of Alexander McKendrick's other films. Of course, the proliferation of jazz music was also racially complex. Like I said, some of the narrative elements regarding music are a little iffy in this movie. It might be interesting to think about how that links into the style of the film itself. In many ways, this movie is bringing together a lot of somewhat uncommon elements, and it could be much more of a mess than it is. Like I said, this is predominantly a story about white characters, but we do enter some interesting black spaces from time to time. The International Club, or Tulip, another club. Interesting scenes. In some ways, bringing new characters to the screen. In some ways, hinting at some sort of empowerment, but also leaning on stereotypes from time to time. So, interesting. Like I said, this movie brings a lot of stuff together. It could have been much more of a mess. That's Sapphire. If you really like Victim, maybe this movie is checking out. In some ways, it's pretty cool. It's fun to watch. It's very British, definitely. You might be put off a little bit by the acting, maybe. The acting might seem a little bit over the top. I think in some ways it is, and in some ways it's just British and a film of that time. I also think it takes a little bit for the movie to get going. Starts a little bit slowly, but once the screws start to tighten, both in terms of the story and in terms of some of the ideological elements of the plot, it gets more and more interesting to watch. The racial elements are interesting. Sometimes people look at movies like this and say that it was once ahead of its time, but now is dated. And I guess I said something very similar to this already, but I think it's more complicated than that. And there's a lot more to get out of the movie than that it's simply the older version of today's didactic cinema. Progressivism isn't some linear thing where opinions are continuously refined. The way that we think about conflicts changes. The conflicts that we think about changes. We take detours we take ideological detours down the years, and it's interesting. In other words, old ideas are interesting. Interesting to see how people thought about things. And Sapphire gives you that. Without a doubt, probably don't watch this movie looking for a perfect, a film that will perfectly match the moral sensibilities of today. It's not crazy, but I think it's a lot more interesting as, I guess, a sociological or historical film, and it's also pretty good as a thriller. So overall, Sapphire, it's probably worth checking out, especially if you have any familiarity with a movie like Victim, or if you're sort of interested in this era of British cinema.